I'm very pleased to introduce Ira Forman, who was sworn in as Special Envoy to monitor and combat anti-Semitism on May 20th, 2013. Inspired by his parents' values, Mr. Forman has accumulated 30 years of experience in Jewish communal work and public service. Most recently, Mr. Forman served as the Jewish Outreach Director for the Obama for America campaign. He served for nearly 15 years as the Executive Director of the National Jewish Democratic Council and spent 4 years with the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, where he worked as Political Director and Legislative Liaison. He has also served on the boards of a number of Jewish nonprofits. In the Clinton administration, Mr. Forman was the Director of Congressional Relations for the Office of Personnel Management. Earlier in his career, he worked as a professional staff of the Public Works and Transportation Committee in the U.S. House of Representatives. Throughout his career, he has spoken and written extensively on Jewish history and public policy. Mr. Forman co-edited and wrote for the reference book, Jews in American Politics. He has written articles on these topics for the Encyclopedia Judaica. He also staffed and helped edit the volume, Democrats and the American Idea, in his role as a fellow in the American Politics and the Economy at the Center for National Policy. Mr. Forman received his BA from Harvard University, where he graduated magna cum laude in government. He received his MBA from Stanford University's Graduate School of Business.
Well, thank you very much for that overlong but kind introduction. I want to start by thanking MEMRI. One half of the job that I do is monitor anti-Semitism. The other half, of course, is combating. And in the monitoring piece, the MEMRI material that we get on an ongoing basis and every year is vital to our work and is reflected in a lot of the reports you'll see, the two most important government reports, I think, that come out every year, the Human Rights Report, which we should see in February, and the International Religious Freedom Report. And so I thank you for that, and thank you for your ongoing work. And it's a little daunting to address a group like this because of your great knowledge. And I've only been on the job for 8 months in this important job. So you'll forgive me any errors I make, and you hopefully will correct me as well. So what I'd like to do today is speak a little bit about how I see anti-Semitism in 2014. How bad is it? And talk a little bit then about the trend lines I see, and then perhaps what we can do about it. So how big a problem is anti-Semitism in 2014? The best way I know how to do that is to look at history. And one of the debates I've heard over the last few years, and as we view the situation with anti-Semitism, is the question, are we back in the 1930s? Are we repeating that history? And frankly, there are some parallels. In Europe today, we see parliamentary parties with significant representation who are openly xenophobic, openly anti-Semitic, who talk about blood libel in parliament, who talk about the protocols of the elders of Zion. Parties like Jobbik, parties like Golden Dawn in Greece, Jobbik in Hungary, and this is the crucial piece, they have street militia. When was the last time we saw that? 1933, before the Nazis took over in Germany. Secondly, all across the world, we see Der Strömer-like cartoons and material coming out in droves, dehumanizing the Jew, oftentimes other material dehumanizing others. We have a country, Iran, which is dedicated to destroying a country of 6 million Jews. And we are facing the worst recession since the Great Depression. These are important parallels. But there are also some differences. And I think it's important to recognize the differences as well as the parallels. First, Iran is not National Socialist Germany. It is not the preeminent world power. It is a great threat to peace, but it is not Nazi Germany. Secondly, Israel can take care of itself, can self-defend, and Israel can take care of other Jewish communities around the world. Thirdly, except for perhaps the state of Iran, we don't have the same type of openly anti-Semitic governments around the world that we had even beyond Nazi Germany in the 30s. Most governments try to protect their Jewish populations. And there are other countries where Jews can go to. This was not the case, as many of you know, in the 1930s. There was no place to go. Jews today in Europe, for example, have European passports, EU passports. There are many countries they can go to. They can go to Israel. And though we don't have an open immigration system here like we had before the 20s, many people can come here. There are places to go. So the answer to that question, are we like the 1930s, unfortunately is an ambiguous one. There are parallels and there are differences. It's important for us to be concerned, very concerned, but it's not yet time to say the sky is falling. And to add to that problem, if you look at the problem of anti-Semitism in the world, and let's compare it to, for example, the problem with Soviet Jewry that we faced in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s, there is no single address that we can go to like we used to be able to go to the Kremlin to solve this problem. The differences in anti-Semitism even within Europe, are dramatic. And I see it every day. And the differences that we see in places like the Middle East are even more dramatic. So let's talk about trend lines if we can't say if it's exactly the 30s. What is the trend? Well, there are some good trends. Already I've heard from two of the speakers who've talked about the bipartisanship in a time when we have very little bipartisanship. The question of anti-Semitism is one of the classic bipartisan issues. This office that I hold was created in 2004 by co-sponsors as diverse as Tom Lantos and George Voinovich, Republican from Ohio. Of course, Lantos, a Democrat from California, Republican Chris Smith from New Jersey. And the support for this office by both Democratic and Republican administrations has been consistent. That's one of the good news. And just yesterday, on International Holocaust Remembrance Day, President Obama put out a good statement. My boss, Secretary Kerry, I urge you to go to the State Department website. A very powerful statement, not just about historical anti-Semitism, but about anti-Semitism today, and because of his own personal story, his great-uncle and great-aunt perishing in the Holocaust. He understands directly the connection between the Holocaust of yesteryear and what's happening today. And even very interesting, I'd ask you to go to the UN website where our ambassador to the UN, Ambassador Power, talks about how the Holocaust and genocide are not inevitable. She talks, frankly, about January of 1944, when President Roosevelt put together the War Refugee Board that resulted in perhaps 200,000 Jews being saved. But Ambassador Power asked the question, what if the War Refugee Board had happened a year before, in January 1943, and that power that went to the Treasury to save Jews and sent Raoul Wallenberg to Budapest, what if it had happened in January 1943, when we knew the Holocaust was happening? Could perhaps another million have been saved? And what about if it had happened in January 1942? Perhaps another million could have been saved. And going back to 1939, Ambassador Power quotes from people who were saying that perhaps Hitler was not destined to take over his neighboring countries. It is never inevitable, is what Ambassador Power says, and that we need to be inevitably and always vigilant. And it's not just our government, it's NGOs. This one is a great example, but there are many more. As I travel throughout Europe, the most hopeful thing I see is young people, Jews, but frankly non-Jews as well, Christians and Muslims and agnostics and atheists, all combating anti-Semitism, xenophobia, all forms of hate in almost every country, and their enthusiasm is palpable. And we have a representative here, I see at least one from the Holocaust Museum, which is an institution that didn't exist for most of these last 70 years, and yet does amazing work every day. And the same way I use MEMRI's information, I rely on the Holocaust weekly to help us fight this fight, because what they are about is historical truth. And to fight anti-Semitism, you need not just historical truth, you need other tools, but it's the beginning, because if you can't accept what happened in the past, you can't fight what's happening now. And there's even foreign governments that we can take some hope from. We're not always happy with exactly what everything the French Republic does, but there is a recognition in my visits to Paris, unlike I've been told 10 or 12 years ago, of the depth of problems of anti-Semitism in France. And even in the last few days, the president of Hungary amazingly took responsibility that it wasn't just the Nazis, but it was Hungarians who perpetrated the Holocaust and nearly 500,000 Jews perishing. But there's plenty of bad as well in the trend line. And frankly, I think there are more bad trends than good. A country like Romania that was not even on my radar in most of the last 8 months, last month on its public television network aired a program on local Christmas traditions, and one local group sang a Christmas carol that essentially dealt with Jews, and not very nicely. And its last line, I think, was something along the lines of, "The only thing a Jew is good for is smoke in a chimney." Christmas carol. In France, this weekend, those of you who go to YouTube, 17,000 people on the street, an anti-government demonstration, and I see a beautiful expose here in MEMRI put out on Dieudonné. But 17,000 people, many of them supporting Dieudonné, anti-government, many of them with their modified Nazi salute, yelling out through the streets, "Jews, France is not yours. Jews, France is not yours." 2014. It's not 1933 or 1939. Can you imagine downtown Paris? Jews, France is not yours. We talked about Hungary. And it's not only Jobbik in Hungary. Just in the last few weeks, the director of the state-sponsored Veritas Historical Research Institute spoke about the 16,000 to 18,000 Jews that were deported in August of 1941 to Ukraine. And what were they deported to? Mass extermination. And how did he describe that? He described it as police action against aliens. That's not accepting Hungarian responsibility for the Holocaust. And then, looking today at the MEMRI website and seeing all these cartoons that I had seen before under the title of Dehumanizing Jews in Cartoons. The Jew as vermin, rats, flies, cockroaches. The Jew as snake. The Jew as humanoid, something lesser than human. As one of our previous speakers spoke about already, that's the first step. That's the first step to the Holocaust. And then another topic that I hesitate to call strictly anti-Semitism because it's not, but should be very concerning for all of us who want to see remaining Jewish communities in Europe. Increasing numbers of calls for bans on circumcision in Europe. Now, this doesn't affect, of course, just Jewish communities, because most of the 30% of the world that circumcises is Muslim, except for the United States and North America. But bans, just this weekend, Swedish and Danish medical societies called for a ban on circumcision before the age of 12 so children can make their own decisions. the 5 Nordic ombudsmen for children's rights in Iceland, Finland, Denmark, Norway, and Sweden have called for an outright ban on circumcision. The Norway ombudsman said, if only Muslims and Jews would just be educated, they would understand how barbaric a custom this is. And just today, in the Parliamentary Assembly of Europe, of the Council of Europe, there is a debate on another resolution on circumcision. Last fall, circumcision was compared to, in that resolution, in their resolution, to female genital mutilation, and there were calls for studies of bans. Now there's a new resolution people are trying to put together. Many Israelis are trying to overturn the original ones, but I noted that one of the one American witness that I saw was not the American Pediatric Society, which of course finds circumcision medically useful and recommends it, but a 30-year activist out of Boston, Mr. Goldman, who says that circumcision is unnecessary and is not even part of Jewish tradition. So that's what we face in Europe today. So in conclusions, I don't think the trend lines right now are very good, and that's very frightening for Jewish communities around the world. And we didn't even talk about the anti-Semitism that we see in the Middle East now. Anti-Semitism without Jews. Anti-Semitism often focused on Israel. Very disturbing trend. And there's another thing. One of the things I've come to realize is that long after I'm gone and done with this office, long after I'm gone from this earth, long after all of you are gone from this earth, anti-Semitism and other forms of bigotry will be around on this earth. We are not here to eradicate it. That won't happen. But there are 2 things that give me hope in this job. One is that one person can make a difference. We're going to show a movie this Thursday at the State Department called There Was Once, about a Hungarian school teacher who took it upon herself to find out what happened to the Jews of her village 70 years ago. And from that, in teaching her students, she created a monument and a memorial in her town and brought survivors back. And now she's trying to bring that story all through Hungary. One person can make a difference. Tom Lantos made a difference. When I met Tom Lantos for the first time, he was, to me, as I was a young kid, an elderly gentleman with a European accent. And I could never imagine that within 2 years he would be a US congressman. And more than that he would create the legacy that we see here today. And if he did nothing else, and he did many, many more things, but that he made Raoul Wallenberg a household name. Talk about one person making a difference. That gives me hope. And the other final thing is, I always like this, the saying of one Jewish scholar, one sage, Rabbi Tarfon, who said, we're not expected to complete the task, but neither are we absolved from beginning it. So thank you all for beginning it.